Well, my name is Gerald McDermott, and I am the Anglican Chair of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School here at Samford. And the title of my talk is The Puritans and Jonathan Edwards on God's Covenant with the Nations, or with nations. Now it's 12 minutes to, and Carol, I want you to come up here and stand at my side at 18 minutes, okay? And push me down if I go into 19 minutes. The theme of this conference is racial reconciliation and the national covenant. Now, most of us know, particularly after hearing from Rabbi Berman and Rabbi Rocklin, most of us know about the biblical covenant by now in this last 40 minutes. Christians talk about the covenant of grace. Both Christians and Jews believe in God's covenant with Israel. And Rabbi Dr. Berman and Rabbi Dr. Rocklin have discussed covenant and redemption in the Hebrew Bible. But what is national covenant? Is that only with the nation of Israel? Most Christians through most of Christian history would say no. The predominant view until the 20th century was that God makes covenants with nations in terms comparable to the covenant he made with Israel. Now, God's covenant with Israel was unique, and I would argue still is, present tense, unique. But God deals corporately with other societies as well. And so, in other words, God does not only deal with individuals as individuals. God also deals with whole peoples and whole societies, but in ways different from the ways he deals with individuals. This is the difference in Christian terms between the national covenant and the covenant of grace. But since the beginning of the 20th century, this idea of national covenant that God deals with whole societies has been the minority view in Christian theology and perhaps the whole Christian church as well. Theologians have rejected it largely because they think it leads to idolatry, treating the society or nation as something to be revered in place of God. Theologians especially took this view after the Vietnam War, which most American intellectuals regarded as a massive blunder. They regarded the war as immoral and concluded that America had prosecuted it precisely because of something like the national covenant idea. Worse, they believed, Americans had come to think of America as a redeemer nation that was called to bring salvation to the nations. But where, all these American intellectuals wondered, had this idea of redeemer nation come from? Well, many concluded it had come from the Puritans and found this explanation in Harvard intellectual historian Perry Miller's famous essay titled Errand into the Wilderness. Miller argued that the 17th century English Puritans gave up on trying to purify, hence Puritan, the Church of England, and thought they were called by God to start over in the New World. Here, they would set up church and state as they ought to be, and their new commonwealth in Massachusetts would be a city on the hill whose light would reflect back to Old England and all of Europe. New England would be a redeemer nation. Now, according to Miller, the Puritans believed that God was dealing with England as a whole society and was raising up the Puritans to challenge the nation. The Puritans were the new prophets, just as Old Testament Israel was challenged repeatedly by her prophets. For the Puritans, it was obvious from the Bible that God deals with whole societies and not just individuals. Just as God told Israel that he would reward Israel when she was faithful to the covenant, he also told her that he would chastise her, and sometimes with exile, as Rabbi Rocklin has discussed, when she disobeyed the terms of the covenant. But the Puritans saw the biblical God dealing with whole nations, not just with Israel. Look, they said, look how God took the society of Noah's world to task when it ignored his basic commandments, which the rabbis would later call the Noahic commandments in the early stages of humanity. The result was destruction by the Great Flood. God did something similar, but on a smaller scale, to Sodom and Gomorrah. The plagues God sent through Moses were other examples of God dealing with a whole nation, in this case, Egypt. The conquest of the Canaanite tribes was another example, because it was divine retaliation, according to the Bible, for the egregious sins of those tribes. God told the prophet Amos that he was treating the Cushites, the Ethiopians, and the Philistines, and the Syrians as whole peoples in his sovereign control of ancient Near history, Near Eastern history. That's Amos 9:7. Throughout the prophets, God declared that he was judging whole peoples on the basis of their treatment of Israel. Now, after the Vietnam War, scholars concluded not only that it was the Puritans who fed the idea of a Redeemer nation into America's consciousness, but also that it was Jonathan Edwards who transmitted that conception to the early American Republic. Now, Edwards was schooled in Puritan theology, to be sure, but he was not a Puritan. And while he believed in national covenant, he did not promote it in a chauvinistic or proto-nationalistic way. He wrote, in fact, that New England, and there was no United States then, was the most sinful nation ever because it had received the greatest degree of revelation but had spurned it. And by the way, he also taught that preached that the Puritan colonists had treated Native Americans shamefully. Now, Edwards wrote at considerable length about God's covenant with the colonies of the New World led by New England. And he interpreted New England's 18th century droughts and plagues and earthquakes as judgments on the people and churches of New England for their sins. And he stipulated clearly the differences between the national covenant and the covenant of grace. For him, as for most of the tradition, the national covenant is with a whole people, but the covenant of grace is with an individual. The long-term progress of peoples and nations is governed by God's sovereign purposes, using, among other devices, the national covenant. It pertains to this life only. While the covenant of grace pertains primarily to the next life, the national covenant pertains to sub-lunar affairs. In fact, God is more strict in punishing a society in this world, now in the long run, that is, than punishing individuals in this world. After all, the wicked often prosper in this world. Of course, so do wicked regimes. But eventually, the Puritans and Edwards argued, every wicked nation or empire falls in this world because of God's judgment. Now, Edwards found it to be a biblical pattern that one can know, so to speak, when the hammer of judgment is bound to fall. When wickedness is pervasive and the nation's leaders defend that wickedness, that nation is close to destruction. Warnings of that imminent fall come in a variety of ways, he said. The nation can be threatened with attack, as Jerusalem was in the years before 70 AD. Or lesser judgments come, as they did in Egypt's 9 plagues before the last decimating plague. Or there is judgment on a neighbor, as there was on the northern 10 tribes roughly 1 century before the 2 southern tribes were conquered. Often God sends messengers to warn of the coming debacle, as God sent Noah and Jonah to warn of judgment, and other Hebrew prophets when Israel or Judah were straying from the covenant. Sometimes, Edwards insisted, even religious revival can be a warning of imminent destruction. Revival came to Nineveh after Jonah's visit, but before the later judgment that Nahum wrote about. Revival came to Jerusalem in the early church, but judgment followed within just a few decades. If revival does not produce reformation, Jonathan Edwards argued, then revival is a sign not of God's approval, but quite the opposite, and destruction was looming. Now, as I remarked at the outset, a national covenant has been a Christian trope for millennia, and even until the beginning of the 20th century. Let me offer several recent examples. In an 1863 proclamation of a national fast, Abraham Lincoln, as president, asked, quote, "Insomuch as we know that by his divine law, nations, like individuals, are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that the awful calamity of civil war, which now desolates the land, may be but a punishment inflicted upon us for our presumptuous sins, to the needful end of our national reformation as a whole people?" Question mark, close quote. That's the National Covenant. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln was more specific, charging that the war was judgment on the nation's slavery. Lincoln made clear that the war was a judgment on both the South and the North. He was no doubt aware that slavery was a crime committed by the North as well as the South in the previous century. Now, in the 20th century, German Lutheran theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg concluded that the destruction of Germany in World War II was divine judgment on that nation for its treatment of the Jews. In the 1980s, after scholars had dismissed the idea of national covenant, sociologist of religion Robert Bella raised it again. He asked, if the Bible suggested that ancient nations were dealt with by God as whole societies, why should America not be considered a nation in God's providence, understood theologically in terms of national covenant? The question which this conference, and the book that's going to come from the conference, takes up, then, is whether considering God's covenantal dealings with a people cannot help us understand our racial divides and the possibilities for reconciliation today. If Lincoln was right that slavery was a mortal sin that received its first wave of judgment in the Civil War, can we say that further judgments are being meted out in our continuing racial conflicts? If Israel was exiled not once but twice in its ongoing struggles with idolatry, is America still in a kind of exile as it attempts to seek reconciliation? If so, how do we come out of exile? Now Rabbi Rocklin has given us, and Rabbi Berman have both given us some ideas. And we know that Israel, after its second exile, took stringent measures to prevent future idolatries by holding fast to Sabbath and other covenantal commandments that pagan cultures tried to get them to abandon. What measures has this American society already enacted to renounce its racial sins of 150 years ago, or the racial sins of not so long ago? Are there further steps which it must take? It seems to me that we face four dangers in trying to answer these questions. The first is historical perfectionism, which assumes that no repentance has taken place. The civil rights movement of the 1960s saw a great political and spiritual change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and many other laws following made illegal racist practices that previously were legal. Whole generations of white Americans in the ensuing decades came to regard as evil what they had previously thought was not very important or even justified, judging another human being by the color of his skin. Now, Americans today disagree on who is racist and what makes a racist, but the vast majority agrees that racism is a terrible moral wrong. A second danger, it seems to me, as we try to answer these questions, is historical presentism, which judges past generations by the standards of this generation. And the latter standards are changing all the time. Just 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, most Americans believed that gay marriage was beyond the pale. And today, at least a plurality, perhaps a majority, the polls are unclear, thinks it's morally acceptable and perhaps even a virtue. Most of these same Americans would not want to be judged for what they believed in good conscience 20 and even 10 years ago. By the same measure, we should not condemn, I don't think, as morally worthless and not worth a hearing at all, thinkers and leaders from past eras who did not hold our same views. Aristotle, for example, justified slavery. So did Thomas Jefferson, though he was a conflicted and tortured soul over it. Even Lincoln did not hold the same view of human equality that most of us do today. Now, does that mean that we cannot learn from these eminent minds? I think not. There's the third danger of reverse racism. This is the sort that asserts that because a certain person is a certain color, he or she must think in a certain way. Or that if I'm of a different color from someone I'm reading or hearing or conversing with, I could never possibly understand what he or she is saying. This is the new racism that is contrary to Martin Luther King's conviction that we should judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It seems to me that, in fact, it's profoundly disrespectful to a person to assume that I can know what he's thinking or capable of because of his or her race. It refuses to acknowledge the human dignity of that person as a unique individual endowed by God with the freedom to act and think in ways that might differ with others of the same race. When Jesus praised the Good Samaritan, who acted differently from the ways that many thought all Samaritans must act, Jesus was affirming the truth that ethnicity does not determine character. A final and fourth danger, it seems to me, is the pride, which thinks I have nothing to learn about race, or nothing to learn from people who are of a different race, or a pride that thinks there's only one way for people of a certain race to think, and that those who think otherwise are not genuinely of that race. As a white person, I must learn from those of different races about race, and I must listen to other whites who disagree with me. I might find in this conversation that race is relatively superficial, which seems to have been King's conviction. Of course, the present divisions are deep, and wounds from racism are terribly deep. But I'm reminded of what the great Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, that, quote, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." Here, perhaps, I think, is where the National Covenant can help. It says that God can forgive and heal, not only an individual, but a whole society. The Bible says that God appeared to Solomon in the night and declared to him, "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land." That's 2 Chronicles 7:14. This vision in the night from God suggests that whole societies can be forgiven and healed. And it also suggests that healing depends on people turning to God in freedom and humility. This is the spiritual dimension, it seems to me, to our nation's division that can never be mandated by a government. There's no room for coercion here, only prayer and humility. This nation is hurting. In many ways, this nation is broken. It's deeply divided. And racial division is a big part of that brokenness and division. But there's hope. The source is spiritual, not political. It comes from humility and prayer and seeking God's face. The God of Israel is Lord, even of this hurting land. We have experienced covenantal judgment and exile, but we can also experience covenantal forgiveness and healing and return from exile. Thank you.